There is a version of Usain Bolt the world never fully saw. Not the celebration, not the pose, not the smile that made dominance look effortless. There is a version that existed in the quiet before races, in the hotel rooms the night before finals, in the training sessions where the body was pushed past the point where confidence alone could carry it. At 38, far enough from competition to finally say it plainly, Bolt named 5 runners who made that version of him necessary. Every record he set, every gold medal he collected, every finish line he crossed with a margin that made the result look inevitable. All of it was shaped by the men who forced him to become more than he would have been without them. At 38, he finally said their names. 5 runners, 5 different versions of the same fear. 5 men he was genuinely scared to race. Number 5, Tyson Gay. Tyson Gay approached the 100 metres with a discipline that made him dangerous. Not through personality, not through presence, through execution. His start was mechanically close to perfect. His drive phase covered ground with an efficiency coaches pointed to as a model. His top-end speed, in any other era, would have made him the undisputed standard the sport measured everything against. Berlin 2009. Gay arrived believing the gap between him and Bolt was not permanent. He had the times to support that belief. He had prepared with the specificity of a man who had identified exactly what needed to happen for the result to go differently. Bolt ran 9.58 seconds. Gay ran one of the fastest races in history that day and finished behind a performance that made his best feel like a different conversation entirely. The world record was not a response to Gay's challenge. It was a statement that the challenge itself had been misunderstood. But the fear Gay produced never disappeared because of that result. It lived in the preparation. In the knowledge that somewhere in another facility, a man was working with a precision that deserved a different outcome than the one he kept receiving. That uncertainty never became reality on the track, but it shaped every month Bolt spent preparing for Berlin. Every session, every decision. The quiet fear of a man who could not be dismissed regardless of how the results kept reading. That is a specific kind of fear. The fear of someone who keeps coming without ever fully arriving. Gay gave Bolt that fear longer than anyone else in the early years of his dominance, and Bolt never fully stopped feeling it. Number 4. Asafa Powell. Asafa Powell held the world record before Bolt arrived and made the world record irrelevant. He was not just a rival, he was the standard. The proof that Jamaica could own the 100 metres rather than simply compete in it. For a young Bolt still finding his way through the professional circuit, Powell was not an opponent to study for weaknesses. He was the destination Bolt was moving toward made real. That changed everything about what competing against him meant. They trained in the same national system, carried the same flag, felt the same weight of Jamaican expectation in a way no athlete from any other country could fully understand. When Bolt's rise began moving Powell from the centre of the narrative toward its edges, the shift happened inside a world they could not simply walk away from. Too connected, too embedded, too much shared history for the transition to be clean. Powell gave Bolt a version of fear no external rival could replicate. Losing to Powell, or being genuinely pushed by Powell, carried a meaning that losing to an American or a European never could. It was not about the time on the scoreboard. It was about who you were at home, whether the system that produced you still believed you were its best product. Powell pushed that question harder than anyone. Not through confrontation, not through public statements. Through the simple act of continuing to be elite in the same environment where Bolt was trying to establish that elite was no longer the right word for what he was. The fear Powell gave him was the fear of proximity, of sharing everything except the finish line. And for a period of time inside that shared world, every training session carried a weight that no external competition could produce. Number 3. Yohan Blake. Yohan Blake arrived in silence. They called him the Beast because his energy was entirely directed at one thing: the starting gun. No ceremony, no charisma designed for cameras, just controlled aggression that communicated itself before a single word was spoken, before a single stride was taken. His starts were sharper than anything Bolt had faced from a training partner. His aggression through the first 30 meters forced Bolt to recalibrate everything he understood about the internal competition within his own camp. Where Bolt relied on the rhythm of his stride, the natural length that his body produced when allowed to fully express itself, Blake relied on intensity, the refusal to give the race any space to settle into a pattern that favoured the man beside him. The Jamaican trials before London 2012. No global stage, no 80,000 people, no world record pressure. Just the place where reputations are tested without the protection of the occasion to frame the result. Blake beat him, clearly, without ambiguity, without the kind of margin that allows a result to be explained away in the debrief afterward. Bolt was not the fastest man in his own training environment. And while the world outside continued treating the London final as a formality, something had already shifted beneath the surface of everything the public was being shown. Bolt said no result in his career produced the specific fear the trials loss to Blake produced. Not because losing to a training partner was more painful than losing on the Olympic stage, because of what it revealed. The gap he had assumed existed between himself and everyone around him was not as permanent as he had allowed himself to believe. London answered the question the way Olympic finals answer questions. Bolt won. The order was reasserted. But the fear Blake had given him did not disappear because the public result went the right way. It stayed. It made him less willing to assume, more willing to be genuinely pushed by the person in the next lane, rather than managing the session from a position of comfortable superiority. That is what a great training partner gives you, not the hell of public defeat, the hell of having your assumptions corrected in private, where only you and the people closest to you understand what it actually cost. Number 2. DeGrasse. DeGrasse arrived at Rio 2016 without asking permission. He was young in the way certain athletes are young, not just in years, but in the specific quality of a competitor who has not learned to be intimidated by the size of the occasion or the reputation of the person beside them. He had grown up watching Bolt the way his entire generation had grown up watching Bolt, with admiration, but without fear. To DeGrasse, Bolt was not an untouchable figure whose presence on the start list changed what was possible. He was simply the man in the next lane. The 200-meter semi-final in Rio was the moment that produced the fear Bolt had not anticipated. Not because DeGrasse won, he did not, but because of what he did in the second half of a race that should have been comfortable, a semi-final that existed only to qualify for the final and conserve energy. DeGrasse stayed with him, close enough to look across, close enough that what had begun as a qualification run had transformed into something that felt like a genuine contest. And as they approached the line, DeGrasse smiled. Not the smile of a man who had exceeded his own expectations. The smile of a man who had confirmed something he already believed. That he belonged there. That the gap the era had constructed between Bolt and every other sprinter was a gap his generation was not going to continue treating as permanent. Bolt pushed through the line harder than the semi-final required. Won in a way that reasserted the order without making it look effortless. Then he glanced across. The glance was not the playful interaction the cameras usually captured between them. It was something sharper, something that communicated clearly what DeGrasse had done had been noticed, and would not be forgotten before the final. Bolt said what DeGrasse gave him was the fear of the future arriving before he was ready to acknowledge it. Not the threat of losing. The threat of being replaced not through defeat, but through the simple, relentless confidence of a generation that had decided the era belonged to them, and had not asked permission to begin claiming it. That is a different category of fear entirely. It does not arrive through a result on a scoreboard. It arrives through a smile in a semi-final that tells you the world is already moving in a direction you cannot control. Number 1. Justin Gatlin. Justin Gatlin came back from 2 doping bans and came back fast. Not competitive in the way that keeps a former champion present in conversations without genuinely threatening results. Fast in a way that forced the entire sport to acknowledge the margin had someone new standing inside it, someone who had not been expected to return, and had returned anyway. Bolt wasn't just defending his title against Gatlin, he was defending the purity of the sport's greatest era. Every time Gatlin lined up beside him, the story of clean greatness became harder to tell. The finish line that was supposed to mean what it looked like it meant became more complicated to explain. The fear was never simple. There was the competitive reality. Gatlin was genuinely fast, genuinely prepared, genuinely capable of rewriting the narrative on any given day. Bolt prepared for that with everything he had, but beneath the competitive reality lived something deeper. A loss to Gatlin was not just a loss. It was a verdict on the era itself, on everything Bolt represented, on every record and every medal and every moment the sport had used his name to rebuild its credibility. After years of questions, it could not answer cleanly. London 2017. Bolt was no longer at the physical peak that had made the previous decade feel like a demonstration. The margins were smaller, the finishes were tighter, and Gatlin was still there, still fast, still willing to step into a final the world had already decided belonged to Bolt even at the end of his career. Gatlin crossed the line first. The booing started before he slowed down. Thousands of voices unified not in celebration, but in rejection. Not because he had cheated in that race, because of what his victory meant for the story the crowd had come to see, completed on its own terms. Then he walked over to Bolt and bowed. Bolt said the bow was the moment he understood most completely what the rivalry had always actually been about. Not speed, not competition, what the sport needed to believe about itself, and what the result had just made permanently harder to sustain. The fear Gatlin gave him outlasted everything. It did not end when the race ended. It did not end when the career ended. It sat in the record books exactly as it happened, unchanged, unresolved. The one result from the greatest sprint career in history that the sport never fully made peace with. At 38, Usain Bolt had nothing left to prove. The records stood. The medals were counted. The career had been completed in a way that left no meaningful argument unresolved about where he stood in the history of the event. What he had left was honesty. 5 runners. 5 different versions of the same fear. Tyson Gay gave him the fear of someone who kept coming without ever fully arriving. Asafa Powell gave him the fear of proximity. Yohan Blake gave him the fear of assumptions corrected in private. DeGrasse gave him the fear of the future arriving uninvited. And Justin Gatlin gave him the fear that never fully resolved. The world saw the lightning bolt pose, the smile, the celebrations that made greatness look effortless. What the world did not always see was the 5 names that made the effortless necessary. At 38, he finally said them out loud.